We have a machine.
Will that pick up voices pretty well, Marie? Yeah. Okay, so we are on record. A couple of people in the family mentioned it would be like the Purdue Symposium on Ethnomethodology.
You wished. Mike.
That was a very small discussion at a very momentous time. I think today, one reason that I organized this thing is because I think it is a time where the ethnomethodology conversation analysis needs some discussion and some rethinking. The other thing is we did reserve breakout rooms for today, but from emails, the consensus seemed to be we want to stay together. Obviously, a intimate conversation with 30-some people is not going to be the same as smaller groups, but we're fairly structured in the first half of the day, or even before lunch, not really the first half. And after that, we can, if anybody sees a reason to use the breakout room for anything else, we can do that. But we already have a plan. Usually is going to build Galileo Pendium fully authentic to the original material used by Galileo. And we'll have that in another room, and we'll also be demonstrating it here too. So that's for this afternoon. But if anybody wants to use one of the other rooms, they're equivalent to this size. This obviously room is a bit packed for us. But I'm hoping that we can have short presentations today, especially after lunch, and wide open discussion. And so just talk to me at lunchtime if you want to use one of the breakout rooms for anything. Okay, any questions about these preliminaries?
Mike, would it be an idea that we're a hell of a long way away here from the total? Would it be an idea if those people came and sat here? We really need to be as close as possible, I think.
I think actually for the morning, it might be, well, okay.
Why don't we pull that down in the middle, down there?
Yeah, yeah. Why don't we do that? That's a good idea. We're going to come round there.
Okay, okay. There'll be some slides in the afternoon, so we'll see how that works. It's just you just have to turn your chair around when there's stuff on the board. The list of knots is very important, and I don't want it to be, reminiscing about the good old days of ethnomethodology, although I think we did have some good old days, and despite the fact that some of us have been around a while, but there is a point to recovering and recalling, reminding ourselves about some of the things that go back to Garfinkel and Sachs. It's also, this has come up in some informal exchanges. I didn't design this meeting to be staging a debate with anybody in particular. I wanted it to be more of a free discussion of the idea of what ethnomethodology has been, could be, is not, maybe not today. And there have been opportunities to have debate about some of the things that a few of us have been working up in the last couple of years at least, and they have not been taken up. And so this was not designed to be debate. Although I think we will have debate. We already started out, for those of us who went out to dinner last night, we had some very lively exchanges, and I expect that we'll have more of that. But it wasn't a staged debate. I wanted it to be a discussion. So if the word gets out that we have this little secret conspiratorial meeting, this is why we're doing it. And it's also also not an effort to split ethnomethodology from CA or split CA into different factions. I think that what we really want to do is think about what's distinctive about both fields and their common origin with Garfinkel and Sachs. Okay. The circumstances, it's next year's the 50th anniversary of the publication of Studies in Ethnomethodology. Harvey Sachs's transcribed lectures go back to '64. Perhaps there were some earlier, but the ones that have been published go back that far. So it's been a while. You could say it's odd that it's still here, given its contentious origins. As you know, the first generation of people who were involved in founding ethnomethodology in CA are fading away fast. And even the generations after them are starting to age. So I think it's a good time, since some of us are still around, to do these reminders and look forward. We will be taking stock of some of the current state of the art, if you could call that. Particularly in part of my position paper and also in the next session after that, before lunch, we'll be talking about some recent turns in conversation analysis that several of us have been looking into. And also in the realm of theory, Graham Button came up with an expression, normalizing Garfinkel, to refer to some of the efforts in sociological theory to turn Garfinkel into one of the great theorists in the pantheon. So, and other things related to that would be worth talking about as circumstances of why we're thinking of reminders about ethnomethodology. Why here? Well, I think that the number of people in this room, some of whom, of course, have come from far away, like I did, this is a good place to have a room and have people show up and be interested in these sorts of matters that I'm discussing. And historically, from going to several mining society meetings, as well as ethnomethodology CA meetings that were held in Manchester, and these are only a few of them, I think that this was the place to have it. And MMU has been a very generous and offering place for us to do this. So that's why here, not somewhere else. If we had it at Cornell, I have very few colleagues that have any interest in ethnomethodology, and in Cornell it's harder than hell to get to Ithaca from anywhere. So even from Elmira, which you've never heard of. Okay, so a little bit about what's doing this. This is not a joke. He is our patron. He is paying for hotel bills and some transportation costs. He doesn't know that he's doing that, but he left a fund in his will that surprised me. It was initially left for Larry Weeder and me, and when he died, this letter was delivered to my house, and I thought maybe it was the wrong Michael Lynch. There's another one in town, because he was by a bunch of lawyers, and I didn't think I was in trouble at the time. But I opened it, and it was a copy of his will and some money. His wife Arlene was still alive, and she lived for another 3 years after he died in 2011. Visited her a couple times and said, "What's this about? What am I supposed to do with this?" And she said, "Well, he liked you." I said, "Oh, really?" Odd way of expressing that sometimes. But Arlene said, "Well, it was to carry on with the work." So I've had the burden and carry on with the work, actually, it should be. Had the burden of trying to figure out what to do with it, other than pay expenses for myself. I thought maybe this would be one way to do it. I also want to try to do some work, perhaps in conjunction with University of Siegen, where I just saw Dave Randall there before I came here. They are interested in Garfinkel's archive, and they have some money, and maybe even we were talking about forming a Garfinkel Institute that would allow people to use money from Germany to pay for labor costs in Boston to open up boxes and see what's inside. There's a house that Ann Rawls has rented not very much has been done with those boxes. I'm hoping to go there in July to see, maybe 1 or 2 boxes, and see, get some stock what's there. So I think some of what he left could go to that, and we can think of other things too. Okay, so the plan for today, we have 5 discussion sessions. I'm going to briefly prepare, I'm going to talk about an overview based on my position paper. I'm going to talk very briefly about the content of the paper because I'm going to present the paper to people tomorrow. There's a larger group coming tomorrow, upwards of 60, perhaps some dropouts of that. And so I'll be presenting the paper. I don't want to present the paper here again. I hope you've read it, or if not, you'll catch on to the discussion and have some questions about some of the themes I raised, as well as other things. It doesn't have to be, the whole story. And then Jonas Iverson and Oscar Lindwell are going to present some slides and some sound recordings on epistemics and conversation analysis that will talk about the theme of action formation. That's probably going to be the most formal of the presentations here, but there'll be plenty of time for discussion. And for at least 2 years, a group of us, including Doug Macbeth, who's here, and Wendy Sherman Heckler, who's here, and Jean Wong, who's not here, and me, have been meeting over Skype, usually, to discuss developments in CA surrounding this theme of epistemics. And so we'll have a session on that. And then after lunch, we'll have an hour-and-a-half break for lunch. We'll have a discussion led by Bob Anderson, Wes Sharrock, and Jeff Coulter. Is Bob here? No, not yet. But anyway, it'll be a discussion on issues in social science and ethnomethodology. And then Dushan and I will talk about a particular line of work coming out of studies of work by Garfinkel and others on demonstrability, and the theme of reflexivity ties into that somehow. And then finally, we'll have Graham Button and Wes Sharrock talk about what is to be done is not quite to tag it, but they'll present it looking ahead as well as to what is currently being done in Ethnomethodology CA and what could be done, taking stock of what could be radical, questioning whether what we're doing is radical, and that'll be the last session. And then I'll have about a half-hour wrap-up to talk about what we could do in terms of preserving something or building something from this meeting. And then tomorrow, you've got programs for both days, I hope. This is going to be an all-day session, not quite as long as today, that will involve, as I said before, presentations and so forth. Oh yeah, we have a banquet at 8 o'clock today at a nearby Chinese restaurant. I'll show a map in a little bit about that. So, so I'd like to thank, though, all of you for coming. It's a great turnout. And MMU, Minded Society, for the venue that we're in for both days, and particularly Marie Chaulier for her organizational work. I mean, she has no formal connection to me, and she and Phil offered the services that usually are used for Minded Society to organize it here, because, as I said before, I couldn't have done this in Cornell. It would be crazy. So I'm really thankful for Marie, and I hope we can give her a big hand. And there's you have the copy of the schedule, but that's it. So I'll be immediately going into position paper and taking questions. And then here's a map of the restaurant. We're here, and it's there. And oh, is it? Okay. Yeah, the landmark. And we're in the those of us who are staying in the hotel, it's up on Portland Street, up that way. Okay. So the locals can tell you how to get there. Okay, so that's Anybody have any questions before we begin with the next thing? No, we're all on the same page? Okay. So I've got a few slides for the first session. These are mainly just to get us started. Okay, so this is just to rehash some things in the paper. I know the term radical. Hey, Bob. Hi. The term radical is a somewhat dated term. Goes back to the 60s. You think of long-haired students waving banners, protesting Vietnam, and so forth. But it is a term that persistently has been used by Garfinkel and some others in connection with ethnomethodology. Perhaps not consistently over the years, but there was a definite commitment that Garfinkel had to let people know that ethnomethodology was a radical program somehow. Right? And you've also probably read about radical reflexivity. Garfinkel used the term radical indexicality in some things that were published in Human Studies in 2007. So it's, of course, it's a term that's used in lots of different ways. Literally, it means getting to the roots, but then what do you do with the roots once you get there? Do you water them, fertilize them, pull them out, plant something else, whatever? The way I see Garfinkel, largely through the way he wanted to be seen, is that he made a couple of radical breaks in his life and his career. One was the work that led up to studies in ethnomethodology, which, as I suggest in the position paper, was kind of a gestalt switch on sociology that you can see in like the clinic study and also the study of coding, where the instrumental procedures for getting data in sociology were turned into a phenomenon. And unless we figure that Garfinkel set out to do those studies in order to look at coding or look at how bad clinic records were, we figure that some shift in attention occurred in the course of that kind of more or less conventional investigation into clinic practices or processes and the work he did. After studies in ethnomethodology, he didn't publish too much that was coherent for a long time, and some people would say he never did publish anything that was coherent, but he made clear in his seminars after 72 when I started to go to his seminars, that he was envisioning a break, not necessarily a rupture from what he was doing in studies in ethnomethodology, but there would be new programs, and sometimes he used the term studies of work to describe that break. And he also, in both phases, used the term most often associated with Thomas Kuhn, impenetrability, to talk about the relationship between ethnomethodology and the social sciences, and then later in his career between ethnomethodology and virtually all formal analyses whatsoever. And so then the question is, well, what sort of work exemplifies this new program that never fully got off the ground, I'd say. Maybe there's some more indications of where it was going in those 600 boxes, but I kind of doubt it. And so that's one of the themes of radical ethnomethodology I want to pick up during these meetings. And of course, on the question of radical ethnomethodology, we can question whether we need it anymore or need to talk about it anymore. And so let's just hold on to that, and I'll work through my part of it so we can get some discussion going. Again, to go back to the reasons for this meeting, as I mentioned earlier, there's negative reasons. The current state of ethnomethodology in CA, I think, is not in every place at all times appalling, but there's some things that I think have gone off track or on track to things that lead away from what I treasure in ethnomethodology, and I think some of you do. As far as CA goes, I'm not wanting this to be an attack on CA, because I think there's some, over the last couple of years, And just to put a plug in October this year, we have a special issue of Discourse Studies in which there's 4 papers by various combinations of us who I mentioned earlier, and a commentary by Wes Sharrock and Greg Button, and another commentary that's more favorable to CA by, who is it that wrote that?
Trina Heinemann and Jakob Stensen.
Right, okay, thanks. Yeah, you can see I'm on top of things. So we're going to present some of that. It's negative in a sense, it's very critical. The other thing that troubles me is the sort of way that there's good professional reasons for bad ethnomethodology. That if, like me, you've spent most of your career working in departments where you're the only one or the only one really is interested in ethnomethodology, you're under constant pressure to make it sensible for other people. And in publishing and all sorts of things, that's something that pulls us in different directions. And so I think it's not surprising at all. There's been a lot of efforts to integrate, and they have been for a long time, conceptually and methodologically, ethnomethodology, really social sciences, including recently what Ruber called variable analysis, a quantitative approach to analysis. And so that's, to me, a negative trend. People can differ on that. The positive things, I think that, since we do want to continue with Garfinkel's legacy, Sachs's legacy, we want to reflect on how could we go about doing that. One question that has come up in American Sociological Association circles, among other places, is the divisiveness question. There was a time when ethnomethodology had a reputation for incivility, and that's when things were kind of exciting also. In a recent communication in a newsletter for professionals in the field, some of us were likened to big beasts butting heads recently because of some unnamed conferences and presentations. And this meeting, no doubt, for some people will be viewed as a divisive, I think I've already heard this, a divisive thing that we're attacking others, taking already a small endangered group, splitting it up and making criticisms of each other. I think that there's reason to be not necessarily divisive, but critical in that, I'll tell you a story. A few years ago, I was visiting UC Irvine, where I went to school for my PhD. And there was a talk by Jean Lave, who was a professor of anthropology at the time I was there. And she was reminiscing about the old days. And she said something about the ethnos being at odds with the other social scientists. Harvey Sachs was there. David Sudnow was for a while. Garfinkel taught part-time when I started there. The ethnos, the students, and so forth got along with other people, but there were arguments. And there was a young person in the back of the room, I don't know who it was, who was from UCLA, perhaps a student or junior professor, who said, things aren't like that anymore at UCLA and with ethnomethodology. We get along with everybody. We get along with the psychologists, the linguists, the sociologists. And I bit my lip. I wanted to say, yeah, that's the problem. Right? Both internally and in relation to the social sciences, I think there's some issues that we don't necessarily have to be mean and nasty about it, but I think there are some issues to remind ourselves and others about, and this is in part what we're doing here, I hope. A little bit on conventional social science. I don't want to go on too long because, again, this isn't the paper. Again, that's kind of a dated reference. We don't talk about conventional social science very much. But there are some terms that kind of overlap that I hope will be focus of discussion. Constructive analysis premise of this formal analysis, worldwide social science movement, raises the question, can ethno and CA avoid formal analysis? Should it? Why would want to? Isn't it a wonderful thing? Is there any need to avoid it? And I think it's worth discussing that there has been for a long time, perhaps always, a difference between the way conversation analysis addresses formal structures of practical actions and Garfinkel's way, even though that Garfinkel and Sachs in 1970 wrote what, in my judgment, is perhaps the most seminal paper, single paper in ethnomethodology and CA. Did they have a different take on it, initially and certainly subsequently? So there's a question of ethnomethodology's relation to formal analysis. Is it and constructive analysis? It is one where we want to do better, or is there something else? And this is a term that Garfinkel suggested. There is something else with asymmetric alternates, which will be something that will come up in discussion, particularly the section that Dushin and I will do. Again, sort of as reminders of what's in the paper, ethno and CAM treating as both radical programs, potentially, actually, historically, if not always now. And it's radical in reference to the social sciences. And you can find plenty of programmatic quotations from Garfinkel, Sachs, and Shakeloff on this point. In the Atkinson Heritage volume, the selections from Sachs on methodology and by Shakeloff on questions and ambiguities are good places to start with this. Shakeloff also gave a little thread in a quote in the paper of how ethnomethodology, well, particularly conversation analysis, disciplines professional analysis by reference to actions and orientations found in conversation or in the materials examined. Whether that's so, of course, is open to question, but that was the claim. There's also, I think, more pervasive skepticism about theorizing, generalizing, abstracting from materials, whatever is meant by materials in both fields. And then, just to give you a flavor of late Garfinkel, the late and the later, one of his statements in the Human Studies in 2007 on formal methods is pretty wild. I mean, natural science, mathematical sciences, social sciences, engineering, technician support, endless arts, trades, tricks, skills, occupations, jobs, and sciences of practical action and practical reasoning everywhere. In all sciences from A to Z, correctly consulting the I Ching for good advice in meeting life's serious adversaries and carrying out the Izande's poison, chicken, oracle, to astrology, surgical, laparoscopy, orchestral conducting, and up-close magic. Now, many of those do have studies. Those topics do have studies behind them, but that they are all formal analysis to be somehow explicated to ethnomethodology raises the question of what's left when you do the explication. So there's some questions. Again, you'll have your own questions, but some of the ones that I hope we get around to. How should ethnomethodology address formal methods? By doing more of them, by taking them apart, doing something to them. Do we want formal descriptions or something else? And then to take a line out of the famous section of studies of ethnomethodology about how does the sociologist go about constructing the cultural dope, we can think of a variant of question. How does the sociologist, administrator, natural analyst, I Ching consultant, member do it when making and administrating formal accountability? And then the question is, this is actually a question that comes up in the book, There's No Such Thing as a Social Science by Phil Hutchinson and Wes Sharrock and Rupert Reed, where they have, in the chapter on ethnomethodology, they point to a possible difference between treating ethnomethodology as an alternative social science that tries to do better than the alternative, or an alternative in the sense that Garfinkel treats it as not doing social science, not doing formal analysis, but in an analytical position vis-a-vis it. So themes will have where terms like framing, terms like imaginaries, which tend become popular in various social sciences, discourses with capital D, treat theorizing as something that is in everyday activities, is behind or beneath everyday activities. And this is something I think that ethnomethodology is radically different, although to many people out of step, out of fashion way of looking at things. I think that that's a worthwhile topic. And I think that this issue of invoking a kind of theoretical underpinning comes up in some of the CA issues that we'll talk about. And one thing I've noticed, it's more an impression than anything I've really dug in on analytically, but functionalism or microfunctionalism seems to be returning to the vengeance in the more theorized versions of ethnomethodology and CA, and perhaps other people have noticed that. And then, as I said before, what might be in Garfinkel's boxes, we could perhaps speculate that. Black 600 black boxes. Okay, so that's enough for me to talk about in this session. We have now, what was the schedule? Another 45 minutes to go, I think, before we take a coffee break. And our coffee breaks today will be 20 minutes long, if that's okay. And then we'll move ahead to the next section. Okay. We can sit in silence for 45 minutes.
So what do you think are in the boxes then, Mike?
What?
What do you think are in the boxes?
I had some in Siegen, this fellow in Siegen named Tristan Thielman, who is very interested in this. And he hasn't really looked, I'm mostly interested in the boxes during the time that I knew Garfinkel best, which was the 70s and 80s. And my impression at that time, not having seen what he was writing all the time, is he worked incessantly. He was in his office earlier than anybody else and left later, took stuff home with him, and you could hear those keyboards tapping away on, electric typewriter. And yet, the volumes of stuff that he put out, I think were rather redundant, repetitive, trying to work an argument up that he was satisfied with, and doing it again and again, and scribbling over it and whatnot. So, but alluding always to studies, right, of material phenomena that he and others were doing. And but what I don't know is what's delivered in terms of studies that would be not already available in the 2002 book and things like that. So I think that one thing that will be undoubtedly valuable in those boxes are tape recordings that he made going back to perhaps as early as the 1940s, certainly the 1950s, some of which are on wire recording machines, which are very hard to extract without destroying them. And their conversations with, in various combinations, Goffman, Garfinkel, Parsons, Sachs, and those I think would be really interesting materials to digitize, and it's expensive to do, and so we're trying to work out a way to try to at least do that, and of course digitize the written stuff. But again, I think the writing may turn. Ann Rawls and Tristan are very interested in the early stuff, before ethnomethodology was used as a word to look at continuity or discontinuity, perhaps, in everything he wrote that's in that archive. That's actually a small portion of what's there, though, because he wrote incessantly in his later years up until, the end. And as he started using computers, it was easier to preserve the stuff. And so there's lots of that material there, and I don't think anybody's really looked into it much.
You think we'll learn anything from what's in the boxes, apart from what's in the boxes?
That's...
No, I mean...
Yeah, I know.
One of the things is,
yeah.
When you talk to people who are students and stuff, they correct you on things, because Garfinkel in a lecture said this, which you've never heard of.
Yeah.
And sometimes it seems as if that's an expression what's available stuff.
Yeah.
So that's really what I'm asking. Is there a real difference between,
Yeah.
you know, will it add a different understanding to what we've got, or will it turn out to be more of the same?
I think both, but there are a few questions I have, like having sat through his lectures over, several year period. One thing he routinely did was to pick up Durkheim's aphorism, which he does in the 2002 book. But I'd like to see exactly how he did it in some of the lectures and seminars I attended, because I think it comes out differently in the book, slightly, and more affiliatively to Durkheim than it does in the earlier lectures. So I'd like to see change both in his formulations as well as getting my own notes. If you've ever sat through a lecture of Garfinkel's, it's pretty hard to follow the sentences from beginning to end with handwritten notes. And so tape recordings of his lectures will be very valuable when they're transcribed, and that's another thing that should be in the boxes. And I don't know the answer to your question, other than to say, well, I think that there will be some clarification found in those boxes, but also inconsistencies over time, because we're talking about a long period of time.
Right, there's a kind of modern curiosity about these open boxes or unopened boxes, but that's an entirely different thing from asking the question, what of Garfinkel's opus, including the book, is actually of value now, and what new value you can find.
Yeah.
And I'd like to make that distinction, because I think there are some people in the worldwide movement who seem to be motivated by the more than curiosity, and wanting to figure out how to drag Garfinkel back into sociology.
Yeah.
He ever left it, and there's a discussion point there. What for me though is, I think, one of your key questions, and you didn't ask it, is, okay, so we don't have Garfinkel anymore, we have the debris of Garfinkel. What in that debris should we value? What should we set aside as the interesting debris we will leave around? Stuff we never intended to have anybody else look at. And therefore, how should we move on? And that, for me, is the question that is never asked. The question is always, how do we go back and start again? And I don't think that's where we can be.
Oh, I see.
I agree. I mean, how radical is an ethnomethodology that's constantly looking backwards towards Garfield?
But at the same time, do we not need to go and have a look what's in the boxes, just so that 100 years from now, someone doesn't turn around and say, oh, God, you know what was in that box?
Well, it wouldn't matter, would it? It wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't change what we've done for the last 50, 40 years. That's standing on its own merit.
Yeah, I'm not saying it doesn't, but what I'm saying, if there's an archive there full of material, is there...
Are you going to start doing something different tomorrow because you found a new text?
No, that's not my question. No, that's not my question.
No.
All I want to say is, there's an archive there, and what seems being said is that, or part of what's being said, is that, right, that's fine, we'll just leave it. We're not going to find anything which is there, so let's not bother. Which...
I don't think that was, let's get it clear. I don't think anybody was saying that.
I was exaggerating.
What we're trying to do is distinguish two sets of interests, so that we don't get all consumed by only one. That's really all, certainly what I was saying, was that there are two interests, and we all have the more than curiosity of exactly what's in these boxes, and where's his question? Will we actually get something that's really going to change the way we look at things? We don't know.
Well, I was really asking about witnesses. You know, a report, what sounds like a different version of what Garfinkel was up to at certain stages when they were attending his lectures, when he was up to at other times that are familiar from the literature. You know, it's not. So it was more. It only applies to the box in the sense of one might be expecting to find some quite different conceptions of what Ethno might be up to in there to what's being delivered in the lectures, or is at least known to people who went to those. I mean, I wasn't here in 73 when Garfield Yes, that's right. Chemistry, alchemy, yeah, chemistry discovered alchemy. No, I mean, but that was Harold, like radical reflexivity, and he went on and on about it on the rare occasions I get him to talk. And Trent-Egling was the example, so that was clearly transitional, because radical reflexivity in many ways disappeared. And certainly Trent-Egling got dropped or wasn't referred to and so on. So it was really that kind of how much incongruity is there between the available record and the actual one.
It seems to me that it's important to consider whose job it is to actually look in boxes in the first place and what we're going to do with those boxes. Because it seems to me a redundant exercise for an practicing ethnomethodologist to go through all those boxes and do all of that work. But a historical scholar might well be interested in actually doing that job of work for other reasons. And there might be little bits and pieces that we then see out of that material that they produce that we might find interesting and useful. But it seems to make an ethnomethodologist go through the work of doing that rather pointless.
Yeah, but I think Bob makes an important point, which is there may be agendas at work on behalf of people who maybe want to look in boxes, such that they can find evidence for ways in which they believe that ethnomethodology has a different relationship to sociology, social sciences, than the relationship that we here probably see it as having. And so it will be interesting to discuss what those agendas might be, and it might be interesting mainly because I think that was the point of your paper, which is that there are certain agendas at work, and maybe a discussion of those agendas might be an interesting thing to start to pick up on.
I think that's good. I also think it's important to sort of when you talk of the worldwide social movement, social science movement as this incredibly disorganised, permanently changing group of people, and lots of the ways in which Garfinkel's remarks about the social sciences were offered were occasioned by fights, contests, debates at the time. Sociology, for instance, insofar as there is such a thing, I don't think it exists as a unified field in any way whatsoever nowadays. I think it's a very, very different beast to which those remarks might be offered, so I think it's good to have a realistic conception of the state of the social sciences, which are not dominated by logical positivism, structural functionalism in the way they once were. It's a different entity thinking about it.
I mean, I think it's kind of ironic that Garfinkel's archive would be subject of scholastic interest, since he consistently railed against literary analyses and scholasticism. He didn't use the word scholastic, but the kind of reverence of text and authors and chains of authors. And so, yes, I think Bob's question is very well pointed. That I don't think I'll recruit too many eager box openers in this room to, go to this house in Massachusetts and start digging through in hopes of finding something that would be historically interesting or pruriently interesting. But I do think that some of these questions that came up, like I recall sitting in a bar with Garfinkel when I was a beginning student. He's going on for hours about radical reflexivity, but I couldn't reproduce what that was about, not just because of the state of drink, but the length of time that has passed and the entanglements of his discourse. I would be curious to see what he does in light of the versions of reflexivity you get out of Palmer and social sciences, that maybe there was something quite interestingly and illuminatingly different for that particular point. Now, that's just one thing that he probably has in writing. Another, these are curiosities, but I think that they bear on current work as well, especially here, where there's all this interest in Wittgenstein. Will we find in any of those boxes much evidence that Garfinkel took Wittgenstein very seriously? Because there's not, you would think he did, from hearing what he says. Maybe that's all we need. But he explicitly paid reverence to the phenomenologists, even though he advised us to misread them. So said much about Wittgenstein, and it would seem that with the trajectory in the way, particularly conversation analysis developed, and Garfinkel's own writings about indexicality, that he was quite well informed about Wittgenstein, and but there's no evidence in his published writing other than a few stray remarks, and so I guess that's a scholarly interest, but it's something I think that is more than just tracing him back to lineages, since it bears on our understanding of ethnomethodology as well, I think.
Mike, I don't want to terminate the day, but I'd like to go to the end, the very last session. And you've got the wrap up, which is quite, we're all going to go down the pub, we know that. But are you hoping to come out of the day with a work programme, a kind of structure of things to be done by whoever wants to put their hand up and say, yep, that's something I can and will do? Or are you thinking of something else, something more? The reason why I say that is that the conversations, I said this in a note, the conversations we can have a great danger of spinning, and they're all wonderful, but we'll have a wonderful day in a spinning conversation, and as Andy just said, nothing will have changed tomorrow morning. And I just wonder whether if you are thinking about trying to change things tomorrow morning, and therefore what are the actions you would like to see taken. I don't ask you to specify the work programme now, I guess that's what has to happen. If that's what you want, that's what has to happen at the end. But is that where you're going with today?
It all depends.
Yes or no, I like my answer.
Yeah. I haven't really thought in so precise a way about what I'd hope to learn from this. I'm already in the process of writing, manuscript on radical ethnomethodology, and as I said, several of us are involved in this rethinking epistemics, and we have a special issue coming out, and probably more work to come on that. And on both of these projects, I think I personally could learn from the group that I invited here, and along with Wes, and about what I might be talking about, and what we might have as arguments about epistemics, about current trends in CA. That's rather personally located, but it's in the trajectory that I'm in right now. And so for me, I want it to be informative. I also would like to see, maybe a volume or something come out of that, but you always want a volume to come out of a meeting. I think that's one of the things I'd like to discuss at the end. I think one thing that's inadvertent, but could be maybe the most important thing to come out of this, would be just that we are doing it, that we are meeting, talking about radical ethnomethodology, not doing ethno-CA as it's kind of institutionalized elsewhere, and creating some anxieties elsewhere. Perhaps not the ones we want to create, but I think that that itself could be interesting as an upshot of this. Yeah.
Well, I read your position paper, Mike. It's like, there's some people are building obstructions on the railroad that are possibly going to derail the train. And what you wanted to gather us together was to understand what that debris that's been piled up on the railway looks like, to get a deeper handle on that, to see how you could go about clearing that and putting the train back on the track, or putting the lever and sending it off on another track.
Yeah.
But they were the things I thought that you were wanting to get out on the table. What is the current state perplexes you, to understand that in terms of the collectivity as opposed to just you and a few others, and then to see how you could go about removing those obstructions. And maybe I misread the paper.
No, I think that my immediate ambition isn't quite so strong. I don't think I have a lever that can put the train back on the tracks. What I minimally would like to do is put on record that there's a sizable group of us. Now, we don't all have to sign a Declaration of Independence from UCLA or something, but that we are discussing the possibility that ethnomethodology can be understood differently than in the kind of canonical, if there is a canonical way in which it's understood. Get that on record and then see where it goes from there. It may be it's just for posterity, but it's to put on record to make. That's why I was saying that the fact that we're doing this and are unnoticed for having done. I didn't, publicize this very widely. We sent out through the Mind of Society group, and I invited people that I would like to hear from. But the word is getting out, and this is already so it's creating space for articulating an understanding of ethnomethodology that's at odds with the social sciences and has been all along, and that has an agenda. Whether it's played out or not is open to question, but has an agenda that's alternative, and that articulated as best as possible. You want?
Can I go back to the boxes for,
Yeah.
for a second? It's sort of relevant. I was just sort of reassociating about it. I thought that quite a bit of discussion sounded here sort of implied that ethnomethodologists, at least those here, highly could be described as reluctant practicing historians, as in the Quasar paper, where the problem really is about, what kind of use can you make of the information about the past. I mean, so we don't know what's in the boxes, but, in principle, you can sort of imagine what kind of uses you could make of it. I mean, and exactly what Graham just came up with. I knew, the business of, you could use it dogmatically, or you could use it to create breaks in time, changes. As people do in their everyday life, when they bring in historical particulars for particular purposes and use it to ground or to contradict or to change things. So I always thought that, ethnomethodologists did very little work on how this kind of historical work happens in everyday life, and here they are reluctant to do it for themselves with the boxes, thinking that if you do that historical work, you have to become a historian and disappear into the past, a little bit like the hero of Henry James's novel, Sense of the Past.
For the purposes of today, the boxes don't get that way.
Oh, well, so that's the point. You want to open the boxes. So
Well, we can't do that today, but we are always saying today we can do something today, but we can't be set when we do the boxes. But we might do something at some point in the future. But we can do it because the kind of issues raised, and the box raised, and talk about what can we get out of today.
Well, people will always presuppose what's in the boxes, and it's probably sometimes better to do this dialectic movement between looking into the boxes and presupposing and then checking it and going about it that way. But not that way, still doing your own projects.
What does Garfunkel want people to do with songs?
Well, that's
Does he actually want them to go through them, or did he regard it as that's worth being run again?
Maybe
No,
like Pandora. That would be nasty.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Whoa, shit.
But I suppose I'd like to know what Garfunkel actually thought about his boxes,
Well,
what he wanted us to do.
I can, Doug has a question, but let me just try to answer that first. For for the last at least 10 years of his life, on the infrequent times that I met with him, usually it was in the company of a few other people, Ann Rawls and some others. And the incessant topic was the archive. Where was it to be located? Who was to be in charge of it? Should there be a group of people overseeing it? And he was, and according to Christian Thielman, who I was visiting in Siegen last week, the boxes are very carefully arranged in some sort of self-referential system. That they aren't just in boxes. They are, well, they're chronological, for one thing, but that archives don't just drop, right? They are constructed, and they obviously tell a story of the person who, or the persons who helped construct them. And so Garfinkel was very attuned to this and spent many years inconsistently figuring out what to do. Right? He was torn by various possibilities, and there's some very interesting stories about what he set up and then pulled back from and so forth. But he certainly was attuned to, attentive to, oriented to, obsessed with, compelled by the work of archiving his life and or his literary life.
Are we going to have to wear white gloves?
Yeah. Well, apparently it's already getting messed up, but
we're
but
just trying to get
I
in.
wish the bloody boxes had never come. They're irrelevant to the serious stuff. No, I mean, I take Mark's point about looking back and looking forward, and the question is, where are we now? And it seems to me that one of the things that causes us discontent is there's a strong attempt to build ethnomethodology into something professional and kind of cumulative and constructive for the other social sciences and stuff. And what Garfinkel's position was seems to me interesting in this way. Did Garfinkel think that ethnomethodology was a self-liquidating pursuit? That its radicalness was in pulling the rug from under its own feet. The point wasn't just to pull the rug from under sociology, and he certainly did this on more than one occasion, to pull the rug from under other ethnomethodologists, and to pull the rug from under his own stuff. So, I mean, is that the radical thing that we're always going to be, are we going to become decent versions of Steve Woolgar, endlessly trying to pull the rug out from the latest thing, or is it that there's something in between that? Yeah? Where I'm not quite sure what, but those as the two polar things. Is there somewhere in between where ethnomethodology is still going to induce change and perhaps undermine things, but maybe it has to move abroad in this, or in Garfinkel's mind, in this hybrid study system somewhere going to undermine other disciplines. But I take it in many ways the point wasn't constructive, whatever the alternative to that was.
Yeah, well, Doug has been trying to get into the conversation for a while.
Sorry.
Do you want to get in now or wait?
The small point is, I think it follows Stephen's line, but I don't know much about it. But one way of thinking about the archive, the boxes, is it would be kind of nice if they end up with being a bit more productive than Sachs's archive seems to have become. I mean, there was an opportunity to do serious intellectual history work. I mean, apparently it was quite substantial. And all I've heard of the archive has been a matter of complaint, or insufficiency, or its unexamined state. And so I just want to say, looking 10 years down the road, I mean, maybe one way of thinking about it is it would be nice if we did a better job this time around. And without stipulating in advance what interest it could hold, what contents it may have. I mean, but Harold did speak about it. He was grooming it in some way. I mean, it could have been his greatest zap coding exercise, for all we know. But I think we want to take, not as today's task, but as a sense of perspective, to take that archive kind of seriously.
I mean, the reason the boxes came up is I've just come from this meeting in Germany. It wasn't part of the position paper, but it is something that I think it is useful to discuss.
Oh, no, I wasn't objecting to your mention. I was the one who asked the question about.
But
didn't really mean it as a question about what's in the boxes.
But
which
you're
we don't know.
focusing back on really what the agenda of the position paper
what
was.
the agenda is, and
Yeah.
were we coming into it
Yeah.
at this point? And I take it that is part, at least part of the dissatisfaction is with the professionalising
Yeah.
tendencies, the accommodating tendencies. To make ethnomethodology more respectful,
Right.
more respected thereby.
Yeah, I think that actually the archive could bear on that to some extent, the recent stuff, because one of the questions I'm left with from having, attended many of his lectures and talked to him at great length over a sporadic, long period of time, is that very question. Clearly, at times, he would denounce others, including some people fairly close to him, who were, he would accuse them or denounce them or suspect them of selling cheap to the social sciences and taking his best ideas and grooming them for digestion in the social sciences. And he was clearly very passionately opposed to that, and yet at the same time, he would say things like, you couldn't do this outside academia, right? You need that kind of leisurely environment to get this kind of work underway, let alone done. Yet he also had this idea of hybrid sciences, that you would basically go native, right? In the way that Stacey Burns went native by becoming a lawyer, but then she came back to sociology and has done some interesting work, or Eric Livingston made an attempt to do ethnomathematics. For me, that always raised the question of, so what would be the connection to ethnomethodology, the something other than the fields that you would hybridize? What's coming to and from some other space? And I don't have an answer to that. I don't have a clear conception of what that would be from Garfinkel. And maybe he had better thoughts about that than I've seen expressed, but I just don't know.
Maybe it drops out of the hybrid exercise. I'm not altogether convinced that hybrid is about going native. We work in a computer science context. We've done so for a long time. We've championed hybrid work, places in Britain that have driven that agenda forward. We do ethno studies in the CSS context, and we're rubbing up against all kinds of disciplines. And a lot of the time what we're doing is studies that re-specify understandings of X, because you're interested in human beings. It hasn't, we're not going to come back to sociology. That's our space, that's what we were in, and we've made home there. Maybe how we change has got as much to do with where those pathways take us as to any sense of coming back to sociology. And Garfield had nothing to say about those things, because he didn't do it. And neither did his students.
There's a worry I have in relation to what we're doing here that kind of rides upon that. And that is today only to raise the questions, and you raised lots of really interesting and important questions on position making. Is today only about just trying to decide what Garfinkel would have said about those points, or is it about trying to write what we want to say about those points instead?
That's
much more
it's that,
important.
Don't want to do it.
No. Well, it's interesting, but it's not interesting in this issue.
Actually, I want to go back to what Chuck said about how to understand how ethnomethodology actually worked while he was alive. And my memory was always that the whole ethnomethodology as a movement, as a project, is based on the principle of impossibility. That is that, first of all, ethnomethodological phenomena in a radical sense is only a promise and always going to be a promise. There's always approximation to what the promise is, but it's never fulfillment of it. So there's always this chasing a beast that we can never get, that in itself was a form of motivation for many of us. Secondly, that Garfinkel didn't have a project for the future other than what his students delivered as a possible went in a different direction. And so what ought to be done is it's actually finding a new type of work that actually can generate some perspective, and only from within the work that a new perspective can emerge. But until then, somebody shows something of that kind. There's no point of talking about perspective and future of it in advance before work is done. As of boxes, I think that this is just endless reproduction of the promise, and the amount of it just points to this endless approximation to thing that was never accomplished and that could never be achieved. And the only way to deal with this, in my view, is to take it as an example of radical idiosyncrasy of the entire method. That on one hand, you don't have a project, and on the other hand, you have to actually start with the work in order to generate some perspective.
Producing more boxes.
Excuse me?
Producing more boxes.
Well, no, I don't think the box is the. I think that box is response to the missing actually missing perspective. It is just trying to generate perspective and going always towards the something that is always going to escape the final formulation.
Just to back up on that, I mean, one of the things that attracted me to ethnomethodology was its excessive character. So I kind of knew that the ethnomethodologists would always be the cleverest people in the room, and would have read more about the subjects that they were interested in exploring, even when they were massively critical of the social sciences, than the social scientists themselves had read into these types of things. And sometimes it was compulsively detailed, and most people are actually fantastically good researchers as well, and that was often, it's not spoken so much for people that don't have methods as such, but the degree of detail, the response to situations and the rest of it was something which was unreasonable in the eyes of others who would refuse to go into things in that much detail, and that's one of the things which makes it such a challenge in a variety of different fields, and is part of this radicalism in a way I always thought. And I think one of the dangers about the professionalisation is that it's, here's your tool, it does a thing, you turn the crank, findings come out, you don't need to think about this. In fact, if you question it, you're already being problematic in a variety of different ways, and that's where you start to shut down, as opposed to this kind of questioning, querulous, unreasonable, excessive kind of orientation, which I always thought was part of half.
Let me build on that and put you on the spot.
Oh.
Okay. I understand a lot of the concerns that you have about, and others, that you have about the epistemic stuff, because I've read it, okay? But in your slides, you identified some other problematics that are going on by people who term themselves as ethnomethodologists. So what I'd like to do is kind of like maybe explore that and ask you a question just to kick that off. What is it that you find problematic, for example, about Anne Rawls's introduction to Durkheim's aphorism?
Okay. I'd like to reread it to give you a very precise answer, but I see two related continuities that are built into that introduction. Some of it's informative, like that Garfinkel studied accounting in his youth, and it was a course that gave him insight into the work of putting entries into the ledger, and it was that work that was the interesting work, not the calculations that then fall out of, and the equations you use, whatever the forms. how something becomes accountable in that very literal sense that was perhaps historically important for him. And I found that informative, and it's in the introduction. But what I find it at odds with is Garfinkel's own account that he was making breaks with his earlier work, and not continually, that would be kind of absurd, but that he periodically would try to break free of what his own continuity would produce. Now, you don't have to take him at his word. He's not even the be-all, end-all of ethnomethodology, as he himself said. It's out of his hands. But the idea that early Garfinkel was already an ethnomethodologist of sorts, and if there's a continuity through his whole career, I find to be, a creative use of the documentary method of interpretation, and to be taken or left as you see fit. The other thing that I think is more serious, and it's not just Dan Rawls, it's Hilbert's stuff on ethnomethodology and classic theory, doing probably valuable professional work for legitimating ethnomethodology, or Garfinkel in particular, in sociology, by showing that there is this interesting take on Durkheim, or if you like, on Weber, that bypasses Parsons and brings home the goods that were somehow obscured by Parsons' theorizing. I just don't believe it. I mean, I read it and just don't find that to be a cogent version of Garfinkel. And the theoretical enterprise is, to me, quite open to the usual criticisms of those kinds of building continuities with stepping stones of great minds who influence one another. So it's those two things but they're related in the sense that this documentary work of building continuity in Garfinkel that is leading to this not classic sociology, but a novel sociology within the tradition, perhaps radically different from many of what came before, but that there is this, nonetheless, this genealogical connection to Durkheim. I've written about this. It's not a secret. I just don't buy that argument. And I mean, it goes back to the ethnomethodology's relation to Schutz and Lynch, and the idea that sociology is a second-order enterprise that comes on what others have already done, more or less completely, right? They don't need to be supplemented by this interpretive enterprise. So that there's this, not necessarily parasitic relationship between sociology and other forms of production, whether it's knowledge production or something else, but that I see that ethnomethodology takes that on board. Whether it succeeds in doing what would be very difficult, how can you have an academic enterprise given that as a starting point? I see putting Garfinkel and Sachs in a radically different position, and they announce as much in so many words from the traditions in sociology. And I think that's something that, if there's anything to it, right, and it's arguable, if there's anything to that move, that's where I think the theorizing about how ethnomethodology can be understood as part of microsociology or applied to one or another practical evaluation of medicine or law or whatever, I just don't buy as theory.
Is it in part, I've been trying very much to address your question without saying what do you mean by radical, right? But is one of the possible conditions like the ethnomethodology's radicalism has still not been recognised outside of even a subcircle of ethnomethodologists? Because the thing about Anne Rawls, of course, is it's all a story about Harold and And what's missing is Harold's preoccupation with how sociology gets done, and gets done without the theory and the method as such. And that's not there. And of course you've got the Wisconsin, is it whatever, trying to set things up with survey analysis and so on. So there's, in that sense, the radicalism has not been recognised as such. The other thing, of course, is the configuration in sociology shifted enormously since the 50s, and they've taken on board, allegedly, all kinds of things. Yeah, and in a way, ethnomethodology's kind of lost its capacity to speak to that in the critical way that it used to do with sociology. I mean, I don't know if that's a correct translation, but it can't get real purchase on much of what's going on in sociology now. Though clearly it is, people like us are deeply dissatisfied with that at a fairly fundamental level. And so in a way, I mean, it's to go back to criticising sociology, but do a much more up-to-date, better job of it, so to speak.
Yeah, it's not so much that we can't get a purchase on it, it's just that we haven't attempted to get a purchase on it. It's like we don't address it.
Well, I know that you and Bob on your website have a paper on, you call it a book actually, manuscript on postmodernism, which, is used as a gloss to cover a lot of current trends in social sciences, particularly anthropology, sociology, and so forth. And then the book that Andy Graham and Peter just recently did on ethnography is also engaging with the current trends that, in my field of science and technology studies, treat ethnomethodology as backwash, right, as precursor, as something that went so far but then has been surpassed by cultural theory or whatever. And I think part of the reminder of the radical character of ethnomethodology is as a reminder to these folks that they don't get it. Right? And with that, I think we should probably take a coffee break and then we'll go to the next session, unless somebody's dying to have a last word.
Well, where it says what you're calling the radical character has not been recognised or not been understood, but I think there are very good reasons for that.
You mean bad good reasons?
Well, whatever. I think it's important to appreciate the motivation of some of the things that you're worried about and critical of. And surely part of the motivation is the fact that it is actually very problematic. It's very difficult to think what kind of thing ethnomethodology could be if it isn't cumulative, if it isn't theoretical, if it isn't methodical. If it isn't any of those things, then what is it? Yeah, and I don't have an answer to that. I mean, Dewson says, well, it's work, it's the work, but what does that mean? It's like people studying stuff. But I think we need to think about that, because the people you're critical of are not stupid. They may say stupid things at times, but they're not dim. But I think they're responding to a problem. The problem is that they can't see, I sense that they can't see another thing that ethnomethodology could be, other than the direction that they're going.
Yeah, but the direction they're going is testimony to the fact they don't see.
Yeah, but my point is that it's...
Sorry. And not because it's ineffable.
No.
Yeah.
Well, you can open the 1330 section there.
I want to go back to what Bob said earlier about what we want to get out of today, Mike, because it seems to be another point here is, do we just want to slap the people we think have got it wrong over the wrist and say, you got it wrong? Or do we want to do something more positive and inspire other people to become practitioners?
I think the first bit is itself positive.
Sorry. Yeah, I know it's positive. No, I mean, there's expanding. It's the limit about definition, is it just spanking or is it a bit more?
Oh, I think it's just spank.
Spanking.
Okay, let's take some coffee and we'll start.